Hello, everyone. Before I get into this, I want to be honest about something. I debated whether or not to make this video at all, not because the topic isn't important, but because it touches on religion. And religion is something I'm afraid to talk about online, and honestly, it's something I'm hesitant to talk about in general for personal reasons, but also very obvious ones. I grew up religious, and there were a lot of things, even when I was young, that pushed me away from Christianity, things that didn't sit right with me, things that felt off, things that were presented as absolute truth even when they didn't make any sense. For a long time, I carried a lot of anger and confusion because of that. But the more I allowed myself to explore possibilities outside the version of Christianity I was taught, the more I looked at historical context, translation issues, and what the original authors were actually saying, the less angry I became. I realized that maybe the problem wasn't God, or faith, or even the Bible itself. Maybe the problem was the train I was put on. And that's really what this video is about. Because a lot of us are on trains we never chose. Political trains, cultural trains, religious trains, and we ride them so long as we think the train is the destination. We defend the train we're on. We argue with people on the other train. We convince ourselves that we are on the right train, with the right beliefs and the right version of everything, but hardly anyone stops to ask the question that really matters: where is this train even going? And that's where my story with faith ties into everything else. Once I stopped off the train that I was raised on just long enough to look around, to question things, to breathe, I realized I had been handed someone else's interpretation of truth, someone else's version of Christianity, someone else's hierarchy, their rules, their worldview. And the more I studied, the more I realized how much of it didn't come from the Bible at all. Which brings me to the next part of this video. When I stepped off the political train and started looking at the bigger picture, I realized something else. The imbalance we see today isn't just political, it's spiritual too. Because a lot of the ideas people defend so passionately, especially about gender and hierarchy, aren't actually coming from the Bible itself. They're coming from interpretations that have been passed down, edited, mistranslated, and repeated for centuries. And once I started digging into what the text actually says, not what I was told it says, a completely different picture emerged. I keep hearing people say things like men should be the head of the household, as if that's God's eternal hierarchy. But that's not what Paul meant in his time. The word he used for head is the Greek word kephale, and it didn't mean authority over the way we read it today. In Greek writing from that era, kephale usually meant source or origin, the beginning of something, not its ruler. It carried the idea of life flowing from one part to another, not command but connection. So when Paul said the husband is the head of the wife, he wasn't describing a power structure, he was describing unity and mutual responsibility, like the head of the body being part of the same living organism. Even the analogy as Christ is the head of the church wasn't a license for control. Christ's example was sacrifice, not dominance. And if you think about it, that comparison doesn't even fit a hierarchy, because in Christianity, Christ and God are understood as one, equal in essence. So using that relationship to justify human hierarchy completely misses the point. A lot of Christians online say they understand what Paul meant, but what they really understand is how Paul's words were taught to them, filtered through centuries of interpretation and translation. There's actually strong historical evidence that some of the most restrictive verses weren't even written by Paul. The line, "women should remain silent in the churches" in 1 Corinthians interrupts the flow of the text. And in the earliest manuscripts, it even appears in different places. That's a clear sign that it was added later. Many respected scholars, like Gordon Fee, Philip Payne, and Bart Ehrman have argued that those verses were likely inserted. Fee noted that every Western manuscript moves those lines to the end of the chapter. Payne pointed out that the statement directly contradicts Paul's earlier words about women speaking and prophesying in the church, which obviously requires speaking. And Ehrman has argued that a later scribe added those words intentionally to silence women in the early church. Some scholars, like Kenneth E. Bailey, go even further. Bailey explained that Paul often wrote in dialogue form, quoting what people in the Corinthian church were saying and then responding to them. This was a common Greek rhetorical style. So when Paul wrote women should remain silent in the churches, he may have been quoting someone else's words, not agreeing with them. And if that's the case, then maybe Paul wasn't the one bringing up a concern about women. It might not have even been his idea. It could have been someone else's statement, and Paul might have been pushing back against it, because immediately in the very next verse, that response starts in 1 Corinthians 14:36, where Paul says, "What? Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached?" That tone only makes sense as a rebuke to me, not a command. He's basically saying, where did you get this rule from? But even scholars who think Paul did write those lines don't believe he meant to silence all women. They argue he was addressing a specific disruptive situation, not giving a universal rule, because Paul clearly allowed women to pray and prophesy openly earlier in the same letter. Either way, whether he was quoting someone else and rejecting it or responding to a specific moment in Corinth, the passage doesn't support the idea that women were meant to be silent forever. I also find it interesting that so many Christians use Genesis to argue that God designed the world to be patriarchal, that patriarchy was his original intent. But if you actually read the story, that dynamic is described as part of a curse. And the Bible also says that Jesus came back to break every curse and restore what was lost. So it doesn't make sense for people to use Genesis as a justification for patriarchy and to claim that it was God's original design. And then there's Paul again. People treat his advice to ancient Greek churches as if it were universal for all cultures and all time, but Paul didn't even operate that way. He said to meet people where they are, to adapt to different audiences. He even changed traditional Jewish laws, like no longer requiring circumcision, which was radical in his time. There was overwhelming evidence that Paul adapted his message depending on the people he was speaking to, not that he was imposing rigid rules forever. And his ministry shows the opposite of silence. He constantly elevated women, like Phoebe, a deacon, Jonia, an outstanding apostle, Priscilla, a teacher of Apollos, Chloe, a house church leader, Nympha, another house church host, Typhina, Tryphosa, Youdia, Syntyche. Sorry if I mispronounced any of those. But all of them were leaders or hosts of churches. You can't read, teach, or prophesy in silence. So whatever that be silence verse means, it clearly doesn't mean what people think it means or what they teach it means. Some argue Paul was just being an authoritarian, that he wanted order, but that still doesn't fit with what he actually did or what he taught. His pattern wasn't control, it was partnership. And when you look at the passage carefully, it even says, if anyone thinks they are a prophet or spiritual, let them speak. The word anyone includes women, especially since Paul already acknowledged women praying and prophesying earlier in the same letter. So the very chapter people use to silence women literally gives anyone permission to speak. And when you put all of this together, the manuscript inconsistencies, the historical context, Paul's actual response, and the way the early church functioned, it becomes very hard to claim Paul was promoting patriarchy. If anything, he was pushing back against it. There's going to be people out there that claim he was only talking about preachers, that he was forbidding women to just be preachers and nothing else, but that verse does not specify preachers. It said women shouldn't speak. So that argument doesn't really fit either. Anyway, the more I study this, the more the evidence points away from patriarchy, not towards it. I explained in another video why I believe patriarchy was never a natural design, but something constructed by men. So when people say, I'm sorry, but that's just the truth, I can turn it right back around. I'm sorry, but it's just not true. Sometimes stepping off the train isn't about abandoning your faith, it's about creating space to actually see it more clearly. When you stop long enough to question what you were taught, you start to notice which parts come from the text and which parts come from people. Tradition can be powerful, but it can also be limiting. And if the foundation you were given doesn't match what you discover for yourself, you're allowed to rebuild. You're allowed to rethink. You're allowed to choose truth over familiarity. Maybe the real journey of faith isn't about clinging to the train you inherited. Maybe it's about having the courage to pause, step off for a moment, and to search for what's actually true, even if it looks different from the version you grew up with.